Hello, my name is Matthew Kola, and I'm going to be presenting on generative artificial intelligence and educational leadership. So, to start, let's go over some presentation goals and summaries. The goal of part one is to just explain that the potential issues and ethical problems that come along with generative artificial intelligence, and also speak on a little bit about what generative AI is. So, without further ado, educational leadership is concerned with the ethical considerations of utilizing emerging generative artificial intelligence technologies. Part one is broken down into several categories. First is a brief explanation of artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence, both referred to as AI. And then I will talk a little bit about ethical concerns regarding AI in educational leadership, specifically around areas of academic integrity, bias, and lack of emotional intelligence. Brief explanation of AI. Some examples of AI are Siri, Alexa, and autocorrect in text messages. What is generative AI? The difference is generative AI uses a concept called deep learning, and uses functions such as creating through prompts, facial recognition, evaluating large quantities of data, and so much more. Some examples of generative AI, the most common example is ChatGPT. Other softwares include Claude, which is similar to ChatGPT, except that you can upload documents and it will summarize them, or software that will generate art through prompts such as Dolly or Midjourney. Here's some examples of generative AI. The one on the right is frankly a little bit sobering, and I understand why why education is concerned about the ethics of generative AI. I used ChatGPT to generate this on the right, and all I put in was define ethical leadership. It came up with this. I'll go ahead and let you pause if you want to read the whole thing. The other option, or the other thing that I did, was I used Midjourney, which generates AI art, using the term leadership. It's not as thorough as the ethical leadership definition, and I fail to see how it relates to how any of these images really relate to leadership, except that the top right might look like a military leader. But either way, there is no denying that this is impressive looking art. The ethical concerns surrounding AI in leadership, in educational leadership, mainly fall into three categories: educational integrity, bias present in generative AI, and lack of emotional and ethical reasoning in AI. Here is a list of the references I used for this first part of the presentation. Part two of the presentation is on addressing the ethical concerns that I mentioned and going a little bit more in depth about each of them. Like I said, the three major concerns that we'll be touching on in this presentation are educational integrity, bias present in generative AI, and AI's lack of emotional and ethical reasoning. The first major concern regarding generative AI in educational fields is educational integrity. And as you saw by my example of ChatGPT in part one, this is a very valid concern. In education, it will be really easy for people to cheat. I'll call it what it is. That said, I work with many business partners and many different industries in the work that I do in higher education. And they're all embracing this generative AI technology. So they'll expect graduates or future employees and followers to know how to use it and use it ethically. So we have to teach it, and we have to teach it ethically. The solution of educational integrity really comes down to Brown and Treviño's propositions of ethical leadership. Any of them can be utilized in understanding why we need to use generative AI, but I am going to focus on 5 of them. Proposition 1 focuses on leaders role modeling ethical behavior. An ethical leader needs to educate by sharing how they utilize generative AI, which means learning how to ethically use generative AI. Proposition 3 ensures moral awareness. As a review, that means that Brown and Treviño state that if people don't understand that there are morals associated with an issue, they're more likely to act unethically. So, an ethical leader needs to ensure that they and those that they lead understand that there are ethical issues surrounding generative AI. Proposition 10 focuses on moral utilization. This is, of course, the ethical leader actively using generative AI and going a step further, constantly assessing and reassessing whether they're utilizing the technology ethically. Proposition 12 is ethical monitoring. This is going to boil down to an ethical leader being open that they're using generative AI and making sure that they create a space or a culture where people understand that generative AI can be used, they understand how they can use it, and they understand when is appropriate and when is not appropriate to use it. This brings me to Proposition 13, which is ethical leadership leads to followers mirroring. That essentially, I think, speaks for itself in the sense that if a leader is using this technology ethically and training their followers to use it ethically, the followers are likely to act in a similar way to their leader. The next problem is bias. Generative AI learns based on vast quantities of data that we humans put into it. That's that statement of Wong's that I stated at the beginning of my presentation. So what happens when we put vast amounts of population data into a system? History shows that most policies, most history, just about anything favors different subsets of the population. In America, in North America, it's usually the Caucasian people. So the solution here, it would be really easy to say, ooh, if generative AI can be biased, I'm not going to touch it. That's scary. But the solution isn't disregarding utilizing generative AI as a recruitment tool wholesale. In fact, I argue that it can be a powerful tool to determine selection. I mean selection in the sense that Brown and Treviño use it. I think in educational leadership, for example, we can use it to go through resumes, CVs, cover letters, and determine what candidates fit with the value of our organization. This is the direct inverse of an example that Brown and Treviño state of one of their students going through different companies and deciding whether to apply or not based on the company's stated values. And the final concern here is generative AI is void of morals, values, and ethics. It's a machine, and it creates data using only logic and reason. So ultimately, it's ethically neutral. So why should we use it then? Going back to Brown and Treviño, organizations themselves are often ethically neutral, but we still exist in these organizations and make meaning and make ethics and act ethically in these organizations. And additionally, Brown and Treviño state that followers can be taught ethics and values of an organization. I'm not suggesting that AI can be taught these things, but what I am stating is that we as leaders who train our followers on the ethics and values of an organization can evaluate data that generative AI spits out that's ethically neutral. So finally, the solution as to lack of values-based judgment in generative AI can be found in, I think it was one of our week 2 readings, Rubin and Gigliotti's Leadership as Social Influence. Leaders are meaning makers, which means ethical leaders need to be using generative AI as a tool. They take the information it gives and make modifications that appropriately reflect their or their organization's values and ethics. So my final thoughts. Generative AI is here, and it's not going anywhere. In my work, I use it all the time, and it's a great tool. I really encourage you all to be doing the same if you're not already. Wong postulates that there is a symbiotic relationship between educational leaders and generative AI, meaning that we provide it more information so that it as a tool grows and becomes better, and then in turn it becomes a more effective tool for us to use, and the process is cyclical. Finally, educational leaders should lean into this technology so that they can educate their followers or their students on how to use this technology ethically. Because if we don't use and we don't teach the technology, we run the risk of our followers using it unethically and ourselves being unable to recognize and correct unethical use. Thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation.